We can start now. So hello again to everyone in the audience and welcome to the first of our webinar series as part of the EU Values Network. Oh, great, Giuseppe, yes. Just to introduce myself again, my name is Emily Jones, your host and moderator of this webinar. And today we have the pleasure of welcoming Abel Escribà-Folch, an esteemed associate professor in the Department of Political and Social Sciences at Pompeu Fabra University. Abel's research delves into comparative politics, comparative political economy, and authoritarian politics, earning him recognition and publication in leading academic journals. He is the co-author of two influential books. The first, Foreign Pressure and the Politics of Autocratic Survival, which was awarded the prestigious 2017 Steinrocken Prize for Comparative Social Science Research. And well, as for his second book, I don't want to give too much away, but we're thrilled to have him with us today to discuss it. This book, which has received the 2023 APSA Migration and Citizenship Section Best Book Award, promises to be a really fascinating topic of discussion. And we're also joined today by Francesco Passetti, a senior research fellow at the Barcelona Center for International Affairs in the area of migration and a professor at both eBay and Pompeu Fabra. Francesco is our expert discussant, offering his valuable reflections on Abel's new book. And so, well, before we begin, just a few words about the EU Values Network. We are a Jean Monnet network and a research and education network that unites 21 higher education institutions from Europe and around the world. We aim to enhance the debate and improve knowledge of the EU's foreign policy. The network is supported and funded by the Erasmus Plus programme. And while you can check out our website, sign up for our quarterly newsletter, and if you haven't already, you'll be notified of the great research, our blogs, webinars, and even podcasts that we're producing. And so, well, on behalf of EU Values, I'd like to thank Abel and Francesco and all of you in the audience today. So it's my great pleasure to give the floor to Abel.
Thank you, Emily, so much for these very nice and kind words and for having me. So let me thank you, not only you, but also Alan Tezin and the rest of the people in the EU Values team, and as well, especially Francesco, for agreeing to read the book very fast and being able here to discuss a little bit some of the main ideas. Francesco, it's a pleasure to see you again. So I'll set the timer so I don't get like too long while I speak, and let me share my screen so you can see the slides. Let me go here. So hopefully you can see, you can all see it. Okay.
That's good.
So getting to the point. So migration and democracy, how remittances undermine dictatorships, as Emily very nicely said earlier. This is a book that we just published 1 year and something ago, almost 2 years now, with Princeton University Press. And it's a book that analyzes the political implications of remittances and how they can be an instrument for transforming dictatorships from the outside. So essentially, the logic and especially the relevance of the book hinges on the idea that we have an important number of migrants, of international migrants, people living in a country different than the one that they were born to. Like the most recent estimates are about 281 million people that just represent 3.6% of the global population. So it's the share of the global population that lives in a country different than they were born to is quite small. But at the same time, there are two interesting patterns associated with this figure. The first one is that most of these people are people that leave countries in the global south and move to countries in the global north, despite the many restrictions existing. Okay, so to the point that more than 2/3 of those international migrants are hosted by developed countries, high-income countries, mostly advanced democracies. And one of the key elements about this pattern of migration that differs quite a lot from the old patterns of migration in the 19th century and early 20th century is that these people, this important number of people, although relatively small in terms of the share of the global population, manage to send billions and billions of dollars back home to their families and friends. Okay, so these remittances, the money that migrants send back, financial or in kind, these transfers of money and funds from migrants to their families back home, okay, have been increasing quite substantially in the last few decades. Okay, the point that these 281 million people managed to send over $860 billion in the last year, according to the latest estimates. Okay, And most of the money, also very interesting in some of the things that motivated our research, is that most of this money, of these funds, flow to low and middle income countries, okay? So these $669 billion, okay, accrued to these countries in the global south, many of which are still governed by authoritarian regimes, okay? So the interesting thing about remittances, as this just news that I'm showing here shows, that they have become increasingly in the last few years the most important form of foreign income, of inflow of capital, of income accruing to these countries in the last few years, meaning that they have becoming more important than foreign direct investment, which is another interesting form and very relevant form of foreign income flowing to low and middle income countries, and also official development assistance. As these figures show, remittances have become the main source of foreign income for these countries. Okay, and the interesting thing about that is that, as this figure shows, that remittances have not only been increasing quite steadily over time, but they are not very volatile. Like if you compare that with the figures for FDI, okay, that in some years FDI have been more important. The funds of this form of, especially from multinational corporations accruing to these low and middle income countries, have been more important, more voluminous than remittances. They're more volatile. They're more kind of influenced by the economic prospects and situation in the advanced economies where most of the funds flow. But remittances have remained stable, quite stable and increasing. Okay, and they also are much bigger than official development assistance. Although official development assistance, foreign aid, to make it a bit shorter, has been increasing, especially since the 2000s with the Millennium Development Goals, now replaced by the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's still billions of dollars flowing to low and middle income countries in the form of development assistance, but the most important flow is now remittances. And what is relevant about comparing or having these three flows of foreign income in here? The first thing is that the empirical cross-national evidence that we have shows that both foreign direct investment and aid have been related and found to stabilize authoritarian regimes. Okay, and what we'll try to show in this seminar and what we find in the book is that remittances, because of the specific characteristics that they have the opposite effect. They encourage democratization. They support democratization in the countries in the global south. So the interesting thing that differentiates these kind of flows, remittances, from the other two is the nature of the senders and the recipients of that money, of that income. Okay, so while official development assistance is in the hands of official agencies, essentially states sending money to other states, basically in the global south, okay, and foreign direct investment is a private flow that flows from private investors located mostly in advanced economies and flowing to, allegedly, to private investors. That's only part of the story. So the fact is that for foreign direct investment, there is a very important intermediary role of the state. So that means that that kind of money coming from these actors, either public or private, ends up accruing partially or in total to the state, which can use these funds then to provide benefits to the ruling coalitions, to other people inside the regime, and hence sustain their strategy of surviving in power. But remittances, as opposed to these other flows of income, external flows of income, okay, is what we call a decentralized income flow, meaning that it's individuals sending money to other individuals. It's migrants sending money back home to their friends, relatives, and some other groups within their own countries. Okay, and that creates opportunities, as we will see later, okay, for those funds to have a very important, very important transformative impact on the sending countries, in the migrant sending countries, okay, or on the opposite side, on the recipient countries, because that's the countries receiving those remittances. So those remittances bypass the state, okay? They flow from individuals sending money to other individuals, and that, you know, provides many opportunities for political change and transformation, as we will see in a second. So before we move to the specific mechanisms and the arguments that we make in the book connecting remittances to democratization, let me review very briefly what have been the most traditional sort of arguments and evidence connecting migration to democracy. Okay, so we see that one of the main channels is remittances, as we will see. But previous studies have focused initially first on how migration affects democracy in the host countries, in the countries that receive those migrants, okay? And in here we find arguments, those are not my arguments, we're just discussing, reviewing them in the book, according to which migration causes a reduction in labor wages that may cause increases in inequality, and we know that increases in inequality put tension on democratic governance, okay, because there are more redistributive conflicts that may be solved outside of the institutional channels that democracies provide. Other arguments argue that migrants coming from certain countries lack a cultural fit, so they hold different norms and values that in many cases may conflict, okay, may create tension with those that people hold in those host economies that create democratic tensions, and also that some group of people may hold actually anti-democratic or values that are consistent or coherent with non-democratic forms of governance. Okay. Other arguments suggest that these different people with different backgrounds, migrants, and then the local population may hold different views on redistribution and public goods, given that there are different groups within a society. There is going to be less support for redistribution and public goods, which may end up affecting the quality of governance, okay, because people are less likely to want to redistribute income to groups that they consider to be outsiders or part of an out group that they don't want to help, okay? And lastly, and very importantly, of course, migration has been linked to the rise of far-right or populist parties, okay, which several of them, when they have reached positions of power in governments, okay, they have started or initiated processes of what we call democratic backsliding, okay? But the focus of our group is in the sending countries, okay? It's how migrants, and hence the remittances that they send, affect democracy in the sending countries, in the migrant sending countries. And in here, we have already several arguments connecting this immigration to democracy or the lack of democracy. The first one connects migration to the safety valve, meaning that with young people and several people having grievances, political, economic grievances, leaving, potential activists, those that will be more likely to be pushing for democracy, those are the ones that may be the first ones in leaving a country, okay? And that reduces pressures for democratization and other sorts of policy changes in the countries that see that people leaving, okay? So that's a safety valve. So migration helps some people exit the country so they can raise their voice against the regime. Others suggest actually that having this exit option, the possibility of migration, increases the bargaining power that people have vis-a-vis the regime. So the fact that I can say, whether you change the policies or even the institutional setting of this government, I can leave. And hence, if the government is very dependent on people staying and paying taxes, for example, okay, that may put pressure on the government if the people have this exit option to actually enact some reforms or adopt some changes that may be more of a sort of political development in form of democratization or at least institutional openings, okay? A third more argument, more related to what we did in the book, is the one on social remittances, meaning that when people leave, okay, and they go and live in another country, what they send back to their families and friends is not only potentially money, which I will discuss in a second, monetary remittances, okay, but also ideas, new ideas and values. Okay, so they go and live in a democracy, okay, and they learn about the value of civil rights, political rights, okay, and that they transfer, they send those experiences, those new ideas and values to the people left behind in their countries of origin, and that people then act on behalf of those new values that they may be acquiring thanks to the people living abroad, their relatives or friends, okay? That argument has many caveats and many potential problems, and we analyze some of them in the book. And finally, the argument about monetary remittances, as traditionally presented, only connects monetary remittances, the money that migrants send back home, okay, to the modernization theory, according to which more developed countries, countries with higher levels of GDP per capita, are more likely to democratize. So if remittances affect development, long-term development, they could help democratization by spurring economic growth and modernization, okay? So essentially, the only role that other resources were given to monetary remittances in the process of democratization was an indirect one, an economic one based on remittances being able to spur development and hence development leading to higher probability of democratization, of experiencing a democratic transition, okay? But as we will see in this book, we also think that remittances can have a direct impact on the likelihood of democratization and hence on democracy in the global south, in the migrant sending countries or the remittance recipient countries via several effects that I will discuss in a second that have to do with domestic actors. So here is one of the key points that we also learned from the first book that Emily so nicely also mentioned, okay, is that foreign policies, with the exception of military interventions, of foreign invasion, can only change the institutional structures of the regimes of the countries, of the target countries upon which they want to put pressure, or they want to change, if they affect the behavior of domestic actors. Okay, so think of the case of economic sanctions. You can impose economic sanctions against a country like Russia or whoever, okay, and nothing will change unless something happens inside that country. Some actors see some costs associated with sanctions. Some other actors see their capacity to act against the regime, for example, increased, okay? So the link between these foreign policies, and in this case, this foreign flow of money like remittances and others, through potential political change goes through domestic actors, okay? And domestic actors will change their behavior if those policies or these external actors or forces, like the case of money, remittances, okay, they change their incentives or capacity to act, okay? And in this case, to act on behalf of democracy, to defend or to ask or demand democratization, okay? So in this line of research, comparativists have paid special attention, or most of the attention can be paid to the role of elites, okay? We consider that there are essentially two sorts of domestic actors. There are the elites connected to the regime, okay, having power positions or privileged positions within the regime, and then we have the citizens, the masses, that includes also people that oppose actively the regime, okay? So many of the works on democratization and also on the effect of foreign forces or external factors on democratization focus on the role of elites, on how these forces, policies, or whatever may change the elites' incentives or even preferences towards democratization, okay? But little attention has been paid to the role of masses, okay? So that's what we essentially say that will happen in the case of remittances, because this has been something that has been changing lately in the politics of authoritarian regimes. So in this figure, taken from the book, okay, you can see the share of all the regime collapses, okay, that have taken place during these three periods of time, the forward period from 1990 to 2008, and then from 2000 to 2010, okay, the different ways in which authoritarian regimes have fallen, have collapsed, okay? And as you can see, there is a very interesting pattern that has been going on that tells us a little bit that it's not so much elites now that are responsible, mainly responsible for making possible regime change in authoritarian regimes, but it's essentially and growingly the masses, the citizens, okay? So you can see that a bigger and bigger share of those regime changes are now caused by elections that are multi-party elections that take place in authoritarian regimes, meaning that they're not fully free and fair elections, okay? While military coups have decreased sharply, massively, as a main way for authoritarian regimes to collapse, okay? And the other kind of type of way for authoritarian regimes to collapse or break down that has been increasing notably in the last decades has been popular uprisings, mass protests, people protesting against the regime, and actually, thanks to those protests and those uprisings, making the regime fall, okay? So we have a process of substitution, okay? And those elite-led changes in the regime, essentially in the form of military coups, but sometimes as well through regime insiders changing the rules of the game, okay, have become less and less important, and now it's citizen-led ways of overthrowing regimes that are gaining more and more importance, okay? And that's where we think that remittances play an essential role, okay? So in the first part of the book, we first review the arguments that might connect remittances to the opposite result, to the one that we actually think is the more likely, which is regime stability. Okay, there are some arguments that say that remittances will increase regime stability, authoritarian regime stability, make them stronger and having the capacity to entrench themselves in power. Okay, those mechanisms are three. The first two are state-led mechanisms or arguments, and the third one is individual-based. So the first two focus essentially on revenues and spending. Okay, so some people argue that remittances, this money flowing from migrants, sending money back to their friends and families to their countries, living in their countries of origin, will increase the capacity of the government to increase tax revenue, okay, or even some forms of non-tax revenue. So essentially, the logic is that the state will capture part of those flows, and that will increase the government budget, that will have a better capacity for distributing patronage or spending money that allows this government to survive longer in power. The second argument, the substitution effect, argues that it's not even necessary that remittances increase revenues, but that what we might observe as a result of revenues is a substitution effect. Given that people will start having money so that they can fulfill some of their consumption needs and even some investment needs, and even people pulling money together to acquire different forms of public goods, from hospitals to roads to lighting and so on and so forth. That money is money that the government will not have to invest anymore in those goods, because people are providing those for themselves. So the government can pull that money out and use it for something else that is more instrumental for their political survival. For example, patronage spending, or even repression spending, increasing, for example, military spending. Okay, so people are providing these goods for themselves thanks to the money that they're receiving from remittances, from their relatives and friends living abroad. Okay, so the government can use that money that people are now getting for themselves to get those public goods and some other private goods, okay? And they can use that money to increase spending that it's more instrumental, that is more useful for political survival, okay? And the third argument connecting remittances to the stability of authoritarian regimes is the grievance model, according to which, as you could pretty much imagine, that it's also partially based on what I just said, is that when money reaches people and people can, again, insure themselves against economic crisis and also can produce it can actually have access to consumption goods and also to make some kinds of investments, for example, in housing and in education, they will have fewer grievances against the government. They will hold fewer economic and social grievances, okay? So they will have fewer things in which to complain against the government, okay? So by reducing grievances, remittances, by providing this income, this additional income to families back home, should reduce their incentives for protesting, for demanding democracy, and hence for opposing the government. Okay, so this is the sort of the initial set of arguments that we argue against, essentially, and what we suggest is a model that is based on the exit, voice, and loyalty, the traditional exit, voice, and loyalty model by Chrisman, that we readapt to understand what is it that happens after exit. So we consider exit to be immigration, people leaving their countries to live somewhere else, okay, and from that migration, okay, remittances are generated, and when those remittances are sent back to their families and friends in their home countries, they change the incentives and the logic of voice and loyalty for those left behind, for those receiving the money. And what we argue is that remittances will cause a decrease in loyalty, and I will explain that in a second. What does it mean? That will generate lower levels of electoral support for the authoritarian regime, for the official regime party in multi-party elections, okay? And at the same time, remittances will give some people more capacity to voice their demands, they will increase their capacity for voice, okay, at the micro level, and that at the macro level should manifest in higher levels of protest against the regime. And both combined, as we saw in the previous data and here, remember, okay, should generate a higher propensity for those regimes, authoritarian regimes, to fall and give way to a new democratic regime. So let me clarify a little bit what are the mechanisms that we suggest in the book. So what do we mean by an increase in voice based on remittances? So we built on the logic of the resource model of political participation to argue that remittances provide an increase in income that allows people to overcome the traditional constraints to political participation that poverty and scarcity actually generate. Participation is costly, generally, especially in repressive and information-constrained environments such as dictatorships. Okay, so those funds provide people with the time and the capacity to organize, to participate, and hence to break those constraints and overcome those limitations that they normally have. So the resource model says that resources are necessary for participation, that they enable people to participate, and we consider that those external funds in the form of remittances facilitate people participation in politics. We say that this mechanism is not sort of universal, affecting all people within a country, that there are several groups that are the special, especially the ones that will be, their capacity to participate and they'll have incentive to participate will be most intensely affected by the increase in remittances or by receiving remittances. We think those are the ones that hold preferences against the government already, what we consider to be the opposition people, those that do not support the government, that have political preferences against the regime, okay? Those are the ones that, when having this additional income, will see themselves with a higher capacity of activating, okay, and using voice against the regime, and hence what we interpret in terms of protesting against the regime. And at the same time, we also see that effect to concentrate mostly among the poorest people in society, because the initial income that you receive from remittances will have a higher and stronger marginal effect the poorer you are, okay, and then has a decreasing marginal returns, okay, so that initial income, extra income that you receive in the form of remittances will have a liberating effect when, for the people that is most constrained because they find a situation of more of lowest social status and economic socioeconomic situation. Okay, while people with higher income already, the effect that this extra income coming in the form of remittances will receive is going to be smaller because they already had this capacity to participate in the first place. Okay. So that's for participation, that's for protest, okay? Then we also see, as I mentioned earlier, that remittances should decrease loyalty, okay? So loyalty in this term, we interpret this as making some people, not everyone, some people less likely to show their support for the regime by going and showing up the polls and voting in elections in favor of the regime party. So the mechanism here is that we think and we argue that remittances sever and undermine the clientelistic ties that normally connect governments with voters, okay? So government uses government funds, okay, to mobilize people in favor of the regime, okay? But we argue that when you receive remittances, those transfers, handouts, benefits that you're getting from the government in order to mobilize you to vote, okay, become less and less important, okay? So remittances sort of substitute for that and liberate people from the obligation of having to go to vote in favor of the regime because they were receiving some benefit from the government. Because now you're receiving the benefits, this money, from somewhere else. That is not actually putting any condition on that. And again, we also analyze in the book and argue that this reduced loyalty, this breaking of the clientelistic ties between people, some voters, and the regime concentrates in some specific groups. The first one is that normally clientelism targets poor people within society, because for those, just a little bit of a handout, a little bit of money, okay, represents a very important increase in their income, on their consumption levels, and that it's easier and it's cheaper for the government then to buy their support, okay? So for those people, when they receive remittances, would see that in those kind of people, okay, that would be where we will observe a stronger effect, the liberating effect of remittances. And at the same time, based on a careful examination of the clientelism literature, we also think that the people that will stop showing up at the polls, okay, the people that will not vote for the regime, is people that were mild supporters of the regime within districts where the government sees that those are swift districts or areas, okay, where there is more competition between the government party and the opposition, okay, within those areas, it's where the government normally targets people with some levels of support for the regime and then uses clientelism to make them go and vote, not to change their vote direction, okay, not for vote buying. It's turnout buying, what many governments in those contexts actually do, okay, to incentivize people to actually show up in at the polls and vote for the government, okay. So we think that the liberating effect will concentrate on the poorer people that are somewhat supporters of the government, very strong supporters of the government in some specific districts that show mid-level, swing levels of support for the government, okay? So essentially, by distinguishing, by using these two moderating variables, the socioeconomic status and the political preferences, we're better able to actually adjudicate between the different theories and arguments connecting increases in income, in this case caused by remittances, and the political behavior of people, okay? And we kind of suggest that there are going to be two mechanisms, the resource model and the weaker clientelism model, that will explain how remittances will affect people's behavior by increasing protest and capacity to protest, and by reducing their incentives for voting in authoritarian elections and voting for the government, okay? Because the grievance model that I mentioned earlier, okay, would suggest that people in the opposition and having low income, those that have the strongest grievances against the government, would be the ones more likely to be demobilized by receiving remittances, by this extra income that will support their consumption and to actually insure themselves against economic crisis and other situations. Okay, that's why it's in the upper left level in this table. Okay, and the other model, the asset protection model, suggests that people that receive this additional income of remittances will have more incentives to protect their newly acquired assets. Okay, and will demand institutional transformations that protect property rights better. Okay, so it's at medium levels of socioeconomic status, people that acquiring, that increasing their socioeconomic status thanks to remittances, okay, that will start protesting or putting pressure on the government to transform, okay, so that the new institutions are better at protecting their newly acquired assets, their newly socioeconomic situation. Okay, so we argue that those models will not apply, that mostly what remittances do is increase protests among certain groups, the poorer people in opposition areas, and decrease turnout among poorer people in moderately supportive government support areas. Okay, so to evaluate those hypotheses, we run several types of tests. We use microdata and then macro data. Okay, for the microdata, we use the Afrobarometer surveys, because in Africa we're still several number of dictatorships, and we can use those surveys to estimate the level of support for the government using these questions that I'm showing here. And then we also indirectly estimate the poverty levels by generating an index based on the access that people have to some basic goods like food, water, cooking fuel, and medicine, because that survey does not provide a question on income levels. Okay, so essentially because I'm running out of time, okay, our results show at the individual level that the remittances increase the likelihood of people protesting, mostly among those people that oppose the regime, already, that increase their capacity to protest, to overcome those constraints to political participation, which is consistent with the resource model. We also show that increase in protest among people in the opposition districts, in the areas that are more opposed to the government, to the regime, also concentrates in the people that have higher levels of poverty, which is, again, consistent with the logic of having remittances having a stronger marginal effect on the poorer people than in the people that have higher levels of income. but that effect is not significant for the districts that we call the stronghold districts. That's the districts where supporters of the government, of the regime, concentrate. And then in the macro level, we also use country year data on anti-regime protest, okay? And we estimate several models showing that remittances, high level of remittances, okay, in per capita terms, increase the number and intensity of anti-regime protests in those countries, okay, at the global level. We have data for all countries in the world that have been autocratic, okay, in here. Then we do the same with the turnout, okay, whether people will have a lower or higher propensity, first at the individual level, to go and vote, okay, or not. And we show, this is what this first figure shows, okay, that in the areas where the level of for the government is quite high, but not super high, that's where the negative effect of remittances concentrate, okay? Remember that we argue that this decrease in the clientelistic capacity of the government to mobilize people should concentrate among some loyal people, loyalists, okay, living in swing districts, okay? Because those are the ones that the government wants to make sure that they show up and vote for the government, okay? So it's turnout buying, essentially the main mechanism through which that support is mobilized, okay? And only one of the effects that is significant concentrates at these mid-high levels of government support, okay? And then when we combine that with the level of the poverty levels, we'll see again that the effect of the liberating effect of remittances concentrates in swing districts, as you can see in here, the black estimates in here, okay, and among the poorest people, because those are the ones that are more easily trapped into the clientelistic networks of the government, okay? And that, at the macro level, results in lower levels of turnout, okay? So people participate less in the electoral arena, okay, when they are receiving remittances, and as a result, that makes that the regime party may be more likely to be defeated in an election, as we showed earlier, again, with aggregated data, okay? So there is also another part in the book, and I'm almost done in here, okay, that also we analyze some of the meso-level effects of the arguments that we just said, meaning that on the one hand, we saw that the resource model activates people, some people, especially those in the opposition that are of poor or low socioeconomic status, okay? So we thought that if that works at the individual level, that could also work at the organizational level, meaning that remittances sometimes do not only flow to individuals, friends or family members, but also flow directly to organizations, some political parties, civil society organizations, NGOs, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the resource model could not only activate people, but also make organizations, especially those potentially opposing the government, civil society organizations, okay, becoming stronger and more capable of mobilizing against the regime. Okay, so we tested that using data from the VDEM, okay, that captures the level of civil society strength, which is the right panel in the graph that I'm showing. And we see and observe that the remittances, okay, have a positive, significant, and very important positive effect on the strength of the civil society. Okay, echoing this resource model effect at the individual level, at the meso level here. And then for the electoral part of the loyalty argument, if that means that if one part of the argument said that remittances liberates people from having to show up and vote for the government because now they have an external fund of money, which makes them less dependent on the government money. All right. So we thought that that could also affect at the meso level the ability of opposition party to have autonomy vis-a-vis the government, okay? And again, using VDEM data with this variable that captures the opposition party autonomy, how free, independent they are from the government and from the regime parties, okay? We see that, especially during election periods, which is the estimate in the middle and here, okay? That effect of remittances is highly positive and significant, meaning that opposition parties become more autonomous from the regime during election periods and thanks to remittances, thanks to these additional funds that they're receiving from the diasporas living in other countries, okay? Which again increases the capacity to mobilize and to challenge the government in multi-party elections. So all this combined leads us to our final set of quantitative models in this case, okay, that test whether remittances, okay, have a positive impact on the likelihood of countries experiencing, of autocratic countries experiencing a democratic transition, which I'm just showing the results in this figure in here, and the results that we find are positive, okay? The estimates in here, as I put in the text, reflect the marginal effect of a 1 standard deviation increase in the variable on the probability of a democratic transition, okay? So we have increases of 2%, and a little bit more of 2% when we control for other covariates, which shows that the impact of remittances is as important or even more important than the impact of economic growth and other variables in explaining the livelihood of democratization. So they have a meaningful, important effect. And finally, one set of things that we analyze is whether remittances have a stronger effect on democratization and on protest and turnout, okay, when these remittances come from democratic countries. So in this table, what I show are the top countries that send remittances, okay, which have been pretty stable, the type of countries that we have. But as you can see, some of the top remittance sending countries, okay, are not democratic. So we can think that those liberating or those participation enhancing effects of remittances may be conditional on this money coming from other democracies. It would be that economic remittances or monetary remittances would have a stronger effect when they combine with social remittances. So people sending this money from democratic countries. So we test that idea, estimating the percentage of all the remittances that countries receive that come from democratic countries and that come from autocratic countries. And essentially we find that there's not much of a difference, okay? That doesn't matter that much where this money comes from, with exception a little bit of the incumbent voucher. So the more democratic, so the more remittances that come from democratic countries, a little bit of a stronger decrease in the incumbent voucher, okay, the vote in favor of the incumbent candidates in authoritarian regimes, the effect is a little bit stronger when the remittances come from democratic countries. But in general, the differences are not very much significant. So the argument in here, or the logic in here, would suggest that remittances, the mechanisms through which remittances destabilize dictatorships that we suggest happen regardless of whether they come from Mosul. Okay, so they activate people because it's just an economic effect, and they deactivate some people based on this additional income that they received. So basic conclusions from this. Remittances are a form of cross-border income flow that is different from FDI, foreign direct investment, and foreign aid, official development assistance, for the characteristics that it has of the sender and the recipients. It's people sending money to other people, especially in the global south. Okay, our results also indicate that migration via remittances mostly, okay, can be an important instrument of democracy promotion. And that should lead to an important reevaluation of migration policies in the European Union and other countries in the global north. Okay, and remittances do so. They have these liberating effects by affecting people's political behavior, by activating some people to participate, to raise their voice, okay, according to the exit vote royalty model, and by decreasing the incentives to support and to vote for the regime among other groups of people, okay, and reducing hence the loyalty, again, to use the concepts of that well-known model, okay? The problem with all this is that among the two factors of production that exist in an economy, capital and labor, capital can move freely across countries, which is part of why democracies can actually move as well, but people have and face many restrictions to move, okay? And the European Union, okay, have been pretty active in limiting migration flows coming to Europe, okay? From using what is supposed to be development aid instead of actually to promote development, but in fact, to stop migration, especially from Africa, and signing agreements with certain countries that violate human rights, from establishing Frontex and the many millions of dollars that are put into controlling borders as well, and most recently by approving a new set of migration rules that some people, according to what I've read, being quite critical about it, consider them to be very restrictive, okay? So one of the things that we should concentrate, among many others, is that actually reducing the cost of remittances. So migration and remittances are an instrument of democracy promotion. Okay, that's one of the main conclusions of our work. So the consequences, the logic of migration should not only be analyzed by paying attention to the potential consequences that migration has on the host economies, okay, but also by paying attention on how this migration via remittances and other mechanisms may have a positive, in this case, a positive impact on the migration sending countries, which is in the long term may mean higher levels of development and democracy. Okay, so that's all from me, and I look forward to your doubts, questions, and comments. Let me stop sharing.
Wow, thank you.
It was a bit longer.
This is super interesting. Thank you for giving us a really good overview there of the key arguments of your book. Really, really interesting. And well, we'll turn over now to our discussant with us today, Francesco Posetti, for your thoughts and your reflections. And whilst I'm here on screen, I'd love to remind the audience that we have a Q&A function. It's at the bottom of your webinar screens, and we'll begin that soon as well. So do send over your questions in that. So over to you, Francesco.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, saying thank you to Emily and all the eBay team, Adam, and the rest of the team for this invitation, which I'm very happy to join this EU Value networks, which I think it's very important and provide an important basis to think and reason critically, as the choice of Abel's book demonstrates, about EU values and EU foreign policies. And I will try to be as short as possible, also to leave room to the Q&A session. First of all, real congratulations to Abel and colleagues for their outstanding book. I think it's a real relevant book, on the one hand, for what it is addressed, that is migration and democracy, which I mean are like key, crucial, and salient topic of today's world, as the last European election, but also the current political debate in the US demonstrates. But also it's relevant for how this is addressed, this topic is addressed. That means shedding light on an overlooked topic, that is that migrants, that are those who leave through remittances, allows those left behind to be better off in economic, but also in political terms. And this is a kind of perspective that both in the academia and in the public and policy debates is rather overlooked, because the focus, as Abel was well saying, it's mainly on destination countries. And so this is, I think, the first contribution. Another one of the book is to stress and give back the agency to the migrants as actors of political change, which in the current narratives, mainstream narratives on migration, are reduced in their power and agency, both in the destination countries, but in particular vis-a-vis their impact contribution in their country of origin. There are, of course, important academic contribution of the book, which I won't describe in detail from the theoretical aspect. So I think it's an outstanding application of the Hirschman exit, voy, and loyalty theory, and especially the way through which exit is related to loyalty and to voice, because as Abel has just demonstrated, exit in terms of migration can decrease loyalty to autocratic regimes, but at the same time increase the voice of the opposition there, and so brings in democratic change. And also it's crucial the way in which the authors have tested this theory against rival theoretical explanation. I think it's an extensive and deep empirical study based on a very sound methodological research design that cover micro, meso, and macro dimension in the assessment of the causal mechanisms that are provided, and they came up with a real compelling results. But here goes my comment. I will focus more on the contribution of the book for the EU foreign policy and EU value discussion, trying to place the argument that Abel has very well clarified and explained in his presentation in the context, in the actual context of migration and democracies. And my first comment relates to remittances vis-a-vis other kind of external resources from a policy-making perspective. I won't go again through all the data that Abel has presented, because are the same for the World Bank on remittances. But as data shows, remittances do better than other external sources in quantitative terms. But as these authors have very well argued in their book, they also do better in qualitative terms due to their private characters compared to development assistance, foreign direct investment, and so on. So I would like maybe Abel, if you want to further elaborate on this, saying some words on how remittances can be promoted vis-a-vis these other kinds of external resources, thinking also in the that there is a target in the Sustainable Development Goals of reducing the cost of remittances to the 3%, but we are currently, I think, between the 5 and 7% of their cost. And this is my first point. The second one is about what Abel was already mentioning about the migration governance in the EU. And I think that this captures also a crucial underlying tension between the EU values that this network address and the EU action in the migration field. So I think that both from the lens of democracy, but also of global justice, Abel's book argues for favoring international migration and also empowering migrants at destination in terms of right recognition, but also in terms of capacity building, because this would allow to transfer money safely and cheaply. But if we think at the the policies that have been implemented by the European Union as a supranational institute, but also of its member state, I think that we see rather the opposite. So on the one hand, we see that a significant lack of legal pathways, and on the parallel, securitization of borders, externalization of migration control to country of transit and country of origin, also involving close ties and agreements with autocratic regimes. That this, on the one hand, seems to push toward limiting migration and inevitably to make it more irregular. And on the other hand, if we think also of the labor market's reliance in European states on migrant workforce in irregular situation, I'm just thinking of sector of agriculture in Italy or in Spain, I think that this, aside from reflection on the dramatic situation that these people are living, also possibly reduce their potential in terms of remittances. And this, following Abel arguments, might jeopardize the democratic and economic improvement of their country of origin. So my second point, if you want Abel to say other words on this. And then my last point, it's a more general comment about the scope of your work and in its broader relationship with democracy, because your study focuses on autocratic regimes, showing that remittances empower citizenry, thereby increasing their capacity to protest and at the same time to disengage, allowing them able to disengage from clientelistic relationship in the electorate. So I was wondering whether you could say something more about the extent to which this effect can go beyond authoritarian regimes and might apply, unfortunately, with potential opposite effect also in democratic countries, bringing in a potential change towards an autocratic regimes. I'm thinking, for instance, of Bukele and in the El Salvador, which is one of the most remittances dependent country in Latin America. So my last point was about this. If you want to elaborate more on this, then thanks again. It was a pleasure to be invited and to read this outstanding book.
Thank you, Francesco. Thanks. That's really insightful for your points and comments. Abel, if you would like to respond on any of those reflections, and then we will turn to the Q&A.
Thanks, Francesco, for all the comments. And the questions that you raised are the key ones. And I have clear answer for some of the points, but not so much about the others, which were I may be speculating a little bit more, and I'll be very honest about it. Okay, especially concerning the second point that you raised. So when the point on remittances as compared to or vis-a-vis other forms of foreign income, okay, and how to promote those. So there are several points in here, right? The first thing is actually what is the specific sort of how these funds change or alter or affect the internal regime dynamics in recipient countries, okay, which is partially shaped by the nature of those funds, who sends them funds, and hence the incentives that they may have. Essentially, when governments, official agencies send aid, they have traditionally not had in mind the goal or have set the goal of political transformation or political development. That changed a little bit with the end of the Cold War, where the model showed that after the end of the Cold War, then there was a stronger weight of conditional aid. So that means that aid that was given unconditional on governments making meaningful institutional reforms, that led to the adoption, quite important adoption of multi-party regimes in many authoritarian regimes, some of which democratized, several of which remained autocracies or became what some people called electoral autocracies, okay? But the fact that the money goes mostly to the government provided the opportunity for those governments to readapt to the situation. So even when that money was directed at fostering electoral openings and competition, most of the money was actually led for state capacity building, right? So even the traditional aid was not given for democratization, in many cases not even to promote development at all, okay? Although it was called official development assistance, it was just to get policy concessions from countries in the global south that were in a weaker situation vis-a-vis the rich ones, okay? So that money was never intended to actually promote democratization, and the impacts that it had were negligible, if not negative. So they stabilized authoritarian regimes because those governments could use that money. It's actually a very important part of that money came in the form of what is called budget support. So essentially meaning that these official agencies were giving money to governments in the global south, authoritarian governments, and they could use that money for whatever thing that they wanted to. It was just going directly straight to their budget. Okay, so they could even spend it on the military too, to prop up their repressive capacity. And when that funding was in the form of project funding, meaning that I'm giving you this money because you're supposed to use this money for building a school or a road or whatever type of infrastructure, this earmarked project funding, okay, that didn't mean that aid was not fungible anyway. So that was still liberating some resources, freeing up resources that the government would have spent probably in those sectors. So the government would have some extra resources because now it was the donors that were covering that part of the spending, and they could use it for something else. And that something else in some cases meant increasing military spending, or at least repressive spending, okay? Because not all the repression spending goes directly into the military, because governments sometimes have other agencies or other paramilitary units that are not part of the military per se. With foreign direct investment, what we have been showing and seeing in the data, again, is that they have mostly a stabilizing effect on dictatorships. But that doesn't mean that they make dictatorships worse in a way, okay? So we see with some recent research that foreign direct investment reduces the amount of power concentration within dictatorships, but makes those dictatorships more durable at the same time. And some people thought at the beginning of this process of liberating capital flows, cross-border capital flows, especially in the 80s, late 80s, in the 90s, okay? And one of the justifications that was given is that when money flows, many other big things flow, okay? And that was going to be empowering, again, pro-democratic agents in the recipient countries that are going to be seeing investment opportunities that will reduce the capacity of the government to control the economic sectors, the key economic sectors, and that will lead to democratization. And that was not true, because the governments in the global south, autocratic governments, were very creative and smart, okay? And they found ways to capture part of that foreign direct investment, okay? Because some part of that foreign direct investment was coming from multinational companies. And sometimes multinational companies care more about the stability than democracy. So that we should not assume that the preferences of the sender of that money, okay, should lead to democratization. Actually, they were interested in stability. And sometimes that stability means supporting authoritarian governments. Then that money was flowing apparently or initially to the private sector, and should increase competition and opening in key economic sectors within the recipient countries. But that doesn't mean that that went to private hands, okay? In many cases, those investments were to join or to form partnerships with the state-owned enterprises in those countries. And also governments in the global south, these autocratic governments generated the restriction of, for any foreign direct investment to come into our country, you have to have a joint venture. So that created that precondition for that money to flow in. meaning that they essentially said, okay, there's going to be an investment, but by forcing those foreign investors to have a local partner, we are creating a set of people depending on that money that we choose. Okay, so they were strengthening that sort of patronage network of people depending on the decision of the government on where this money is going to be going. Okay, so they were creating people that had an interest and access to rents that the government were providing. Despite that, those funds were foreign in nature. Okay, so remittances do not have any of those characteristics. But what we have been seeing in the many tests is that the governments cannot capture that. Okay, because actually the data that we're using, and I see one of the questions in the chat, I just took a quick look, okay, although Emily will handle that later, okay, is that actually the data we have from the World Bank on remittances, okay, that it's remittances in dollars that we use in constant dollars and in per capita terms in the book mostly, okay, those are formal remittances. Those are the ones that have been registered. But the flow of informal remittances is massive. It's massive. So there is an important part of that flow of money that we're not even capturing in the book, something that we acknowledge in the book, okay? But still, that money is and it's extremely elastic. So if the government enacts or imposes any kind of restriction or tries to tax remittances anyway, remittances will adapt massively rapidly because they're going to be using new communication technologies to send money in many other different ways that the government cannot effectively track. So how to promote the remittances? Let the people send the money. Make it less and less costly. Okay, find ways for reducing, as I showed it in that last slide, that it's related to the Sustainable Development Goals. One of the few that makes sense, actually, okay, is that reduce the cost of sending remittances because it's still very costly. And that cost of sending remittances varies a lot across region. Okay, so there are two ways in which you can increase the amount of remittances: by allowing more migrants so they can effectively integrate into the formal economy, pay them better, okay, treat them fair, with fairness, and they will send more money. And the other one is reducing the amount of cost that sending remittances entails. That doesn't mean that you have to stop the other flows from aid or foreign direct investment, but you have to be careful about the potential impacts of those funds. Okay, you cannot just rely on the assumption that that money will increase democratization by promoting development or by accruing to some private actors, because that was even the case of democracy systems. So in the 80s and in the 90s, the official donors start thinking, okay, official development assistance is not promoting democracy. The logic of the modernization theory is not working, okay, because aid is not promoting development, so hence development cannot create democratization. So they thought, okay, let's create another modality of foreign aid. Let's call it democracy system, in which we'll try to fund directly democratic change, democratic institutions, okay, in a way that we increase the potential for this money to actually generate political change. And what is it that they thought of? Let's support the state's capacity to organize elections. And once they have had an election, let's help them increase their state capacity. That's the first thing that they thought of, based on the transition paradigm. Okay, according to which democratization is the result of an elite division, then we have an election, and then we have a consolidation process. Okay, so in the end, that democracy system was going to whom? To the state. And the state used that to actually maintain power, to win those elections, even multi-party elections that they were organizing, and using that the state building capacity money that they were receiving to increase their capacity to survive in power. Okay, so they thought, the next thought was, okay, we cannot send the money to the state. You have to send the money to the civil society. Okay, so in the new wave of democracy systems funds, in the 2000s mostly, okay, in the late 90s, okay, they thought, let's give money to the civil society. But what kind of civil society they were choosing? Those that were highly professionalized organizations, advocacy or service-based organizations, were not the most politically involved organizations necessarily. And then another obstacle came, which was quite actually predictable, which is that authoritarian regimes reacted to that. And they started placing restrictions to those organizations that were receiving foreign funds. And they were banning them, okay, or outlawing them and prohibiting organizations from receiving money from abroad. Okay, so either the money kept flowing, but to organizations that were not confrontational at all, or they stopped receiving money at all. Okay, so democracy systems failed to some extent, or to a large extent, in promoting that democracy. To the second point, it took too long to answer to the first one, but it was a very important one. So the EU values versus the EU action. Nothing to add. Francesco, you put it perfectly. Securitization of borders or migration policy, outsourcing migration control, which means sending money to countries that violate human rights and to increase their capacity to control their own population. Because essentially, when you're telling this country, we want you to prevent people from reaching Europe, you're increasing their capacity to control their own people. Okay, so that provides governments with extra funds and extra legitimacy, although I don't like that word in those contexts, okay, to increase population control aimed at protecting Europe from their own people. Okay, so they can play with that. You're giving them leverage. You're giving them leverage. And we know that those countries have been traditionally violating human rights and increasing human rights violations with the excuse of preventing people from leaving their own country and going to Europe. They have agreements with Libya, right, which has been one of the most commented ones, but also with Niger and some other countries. Okay, and so the logic of becoming sort of a European fortress and trying to avoid any migrant or refugee coming in, which is an impossible thing to happen, goes totally against the logic of European values, if there is something that can be called European values, okay? Especially because, again, it just considers migration as a source of labor for Europe and not as a source of something else. And that something else, what we stress in the book, is that something else is better livelihood for these people, and these people will send money back home. And they will help their own people, because remittances are not only linked, as we show in the book, to political transformation. Remittances have been linked to reductions in poverty, to investments in education, in health, in the health system, in the pooling of resources to generate public goods, and so on and so forth. So what is the better way to keep people in their own country so that their countries are livable places? Okay? And remittances allow or facilitate or spur that to happen, okay? Increasing development and increasing the likelihood of democratization, of institutional change. So you have to completely rethink migration policy according to our results, and not only to our results, just because of many other reasons. So totally agree with you, Francesca, on that. And the last point is something that we address in the conclusions of the book, whether those impacts that we identify can go beyond autocratic regimes, and there may be some pattern that may be potentially destabilizing democracies as well. And we have a section in the book, in the conclusion, that is called anti-incumbent effects of remittances. So remittances can have this anti-incumbent effect in autocracies, which could potentially favor democratization, but in other contexts may undermine the stability of some democratic government. Potentially, yes, depending again on who sends that money, who receives that money. Okay, there are strong links to, or put it in another way, there can be some ways in which governments can try to mobilize the diaspora in their favor and benefit from those remittances. Okay, that's something that in Turkey, in the case of Erdogan, has been studied quite a lot. And I'm not an expert in that case, but that's quite important. So the money accruing from the diaspora, sometimes government making very active efforts at mobilizing that money as well, and that support. Okay, so that balance of power that remittances may help alter, in some cases may rebalance a little bit if the governments are very active in trying to as well capture that support and those funds from the diaspora, which some governments have been more successful than others. So traditionally, according to the data, the patterns of migration that is based on economic and political reasons would actually limit that potential effect, right? Because most of the people leave their countries in a situation of political persecution, of an economic need, okay? So they send that money and actually to change that situation, not only of the relatives, but sometimes of the whole country. But whether that can change and whether remittances could actually destabilize democratic regimes is not something that I can totally rule out. I cannot totally rule out. So that potential through activating certain groups vis-a-vis others could potentially affect that. We'll have to analyze specifically what context and what is the nature of those diasporas and what are the interests of whether the government has had this capacity to actually mobilize them in their favor or against the government in some ways. So there may be some anti-democratic groups that may be supported from the outside as well. That could happen. That's not something that we can totally rule out as a possibility. We have not witnessed such an effect, but there are some papers that argue that some remittances may have some anti-democratic effect if they come from certain countries. I think that there is some evidence out there, micro evidence focusing on some particular country, and remittances or social remittances as well coming from Russia and so on and so forth. So there's some evidence that may be a bit more boring in that respect. So it's not kind of a something that can be dismissed up front. Totally. I think I answered pretty much everything, the best I could.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you so much. That was really great, and what an excellent conversation really to be a part of today. Thank you both. And so now, in the time we have left, we'd love to address some of the questions from the audience. I'd also like to say to the audience that we will be putting this on our YouTube channel. So should you need to leave or attempt to answer all the questions, and then you can return to this video if you need. And well, Abel and Francesca, feel free to answer as well. as quick as possible, if it's okay. I will start with a question here from Anna, which is a question for you, Abel. Is the democracy or autocracy variable a binary one in your model? That is, are countries in the database either democracies or autocracies, and do you consider mixed regimes as well? If you do, is the effect of remittances on democratization softened in those cases?
Good. Yeah, the variable that we use to identify autocracies is a binary one. It's based on the Guedes, Wright, and France autocratic regimes data set that they have also a global data set distinguishing democracies from dictatorships. So yeah, so we use that binary classification, and we apply the same one to identify those countries in Africa that are autocratic at the time of the surveys that we use for the sort of individual level analysis in the book, the micro level analysis in the book, for which we use the Afrobarometer. Okay, so essentially we use that data set to identify autocracies and autocracies, which is widely used and widely accepted. Although there are other ways of identifying, but I don't like very much the notion of mixed regimes. So you're either one thing or the other. You can be an electoral autocracy, but you're still an autocracy, but you are not a democracy. So I'm more in favor of binary definitions, but I totally accept that there are other ways of measuring the political regime in countries. You can use the BDEM data, polity data, which I don't recommend that much, and some other sources that indicate democracy as in a scale, right? Based on expert surveys, like in the case of BDEM or other kind of coding by others. But we use a binary definition of democracy or autocracy in this case. Yeah.
Thank you.
I remember correctly, but yes, it should.
All righty. We have a question here from Andrea. I think it's quite similar to your first question, Sophia, so I will kind of combine both. Could you say a little bit more about the countries of origin? If your empirics cover all countries, as I think you mentioned data from the Afrobarometer, did you include other world regions?
Yeah, for the individual level data, we use the Afrobarometer. So it's African countries that were autocracies by the time of where the survey was done. Okay, so the micro level analysis on people's propensity to protest and to vote or not was based on micro data from the Afrobarometer. Okay. But for the macro results and for the meso results that I discussed, we use global data. So that includes all countries in the world that were autocratic, okay, during the period under study, which starts essentially in the 70s, okay, because that's where the remittances data starts to be collected, okay, up to 2010, okay? And that's, for those analyses, we use global data, meaning including all countries in the world that were autocratic at any point in time within that period that we consider in the book. But for the micro data, we use the Afrobarometer, and in the book you can find also a map and a description of the countries that are included and the different waves of data that we considered for those tests. We use that for several reasons, because Africa is the continent with the highest share of authoritarian regimes, because those different waves ask questions, very precise questions on political involvement and participation, also include questions about support to the government, okay, and also ask questions about remittances. Okay, that I think that Sophia or something also asked about the remittances data. So the aggregate data for the macro test comes from the World Bank that includes formal remittances, which has several limitations. Again, informal remittances are not captured by those estimates. And for the individual data, it's a question in the survey that asks whether people receive remittances and how often they receive them. So we created a binary variable on whether they receive remittances or not. But we also, in the technical appendix to the book, you can find the results using the ordinal scale and how often, or the categorical variable on how often they receive remittances as well.
Great, thank you. And well, final question here. What do we have? Is regarding the applicability of this model to different types of autocracies. It seems relevant to electoral autocracies where there are some levels of political freedom. However, how does this model apply to closed autocracies like Cuba or Nicaragua, where opposition parties are virtually non-existent?
It's an excellent question. It's something that we were going to include in the book, but we finally we didn't, just for the sake of having a very clear key message. And the result across regimes holds, right? So we have the global data, the test, without making it conditional on the regime type. The effect of remittances is positive and significant, okay, and very strong. It's very strong in substantive terms. It's not just about the statistical significance. It's just about how substantive that effect is. So, and we considered adding that part on whether that effect of remittance on democratization should be stronger in some regimes as opposed to others, right? The thing is that the classification of electoral autocracy is normally something that we don't use that much, because making that a regime type is very difficult, because pretty much almost all autocracies right now have some sort of election, okay, a multi-party election. So classifying them as electoral autocracies by the fact that they have multi-party election will make that most of the authoritarian regimes in the world are electoral autocracies. But besides having elections, they also have other characteristics, okay? So one of the part of the argument, as the person, I didn't say the name, but the person correctly asked, is that one of the elements of the argument is that you have to have elections, okay? Part of the mechanisms that we stress that will potentially undermine dictatorships is that you have multi-party elections, and some people that would support the government because they receive that those handouts, those clientelistic exchanges will not show up, will not support the government, and that would reduce the incumbent share of the vote, okay? And that's conditional on having elections, okay? That's true. That's true, okay? But again, as we notice, especially after the end of the Cold War, most of the world dictatorships have some sort of multi-party election, okay, at the top level, particularly from a legislative level, okay? The other one, the mechanism on the resource model based on activating the capacity of people to organize and protest against the regime is not so much conditional on the structure of the regime. Some regimes are more repressive and have even fewer ways for expressing demands that didn't go through political institutions like elections or other mechanisms that serve to co-opt part of the opposition. We would expect potentially those more restrictive regimes to actually have an increase in protest that is more noticeable, because those are the more strongly constrained environments, okay? And that's where potentially, and I say potentially, okay, because I don't remember that much the results that we were getting, although we ran several models concerning that before making the decision to not put that in the book because it was long enough, okay, potentially affecting those more restrictive regimes, okay? The closed regimes, that's where the marginal effect of remittances could be stronger, because that's where the initial effect that they would have for the poorer people and for the people opposing the regime may be stronger vis-a-vis those where they already have some degree of freedom and capacity to organize. That's the additional effect, the positive effect that the remittances may have is smaller as compared to when you're totally constrained and you don't have pretty much nothing to work with, so to speak, right? That's the logic of the decreasing marginal returns to apply those economic terms that we sometimes do. Hopefully I clarified that a little. So it's an interesting follow-up. It's an interesting follow-up. And again, it pains me to say that we did not include that, because an important part of my own work on authoritarian regimes have been based on distinguishing types of authoritarian regimes and seeing how different variables may have different effects depending on the type of regime that you may have. That was kind of the logic of the previous book that I published. But in here, we wanted the clear, strong message that remittances support democratization regardless, okay? But that may effect may be stronger in some settings than others. Yes, totally.
A great final question. Thank you for that. And sorry for those questions we didn't get to answer today, but we've run out of time. But well, on behalf of EU Values, thank you so much to our speaker and our discussant and everybody today in the audience. Stay tuned for an invitation for our next webinar, which will be July 15th. We know that now. So that's coming for you. And you will also find this webinar on YouTube if you ever want to rewatch any parts. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Francesco. Thank you, Emily. And
thanks to you.
All the audience for the great questions. They were fantastic questions. Very, very insightful. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.